Congressman Ami Bera is one of 6 Indian Americans in the US House of Representatives. He's been in office now for 12 years. He joins us on NDTV for this exclusive interview. Congressman Bera, thank you so very much for your time here on NDTV.
Of course, glad to be on.
Congressman Bera, the Pentagon leaked report says that the strikes on Iran, the US strikes on Iran, were not as successful as first portrayed. President Trump adamant that Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated by decades, put back by decades. That leaked report, though, saying that it's only been put back by a few months. Which side or which version are you buying?
Well, so I think this is why it's important for the administration to come to Congress, to the full Congress, House and Senate, and explain their side of things, the information that they have, what they're looking at. Obviously, I'm on the Intelligence Committee, so I have access to information that others don't have, so I won't go into the details here. It's somewhere in between there. I do think there was some effectiveness on the strikes, but if the real effectiveness is getting around to the negotiating table, if the ceasefire can hold, then perhaps it's irrelevant how far back the program was set, but rather have we created the context for negotiation.
If you're saying that we're somewhere in between, are we likely to see more military action to get beyond what we've achieved or what the United States has achieved so far?
These are all questions that we have for President Trump, for his administration. What's the strategy here? Again, if the strategy was to do some direct strikes, whether it was set back months or years, I don't think it was set back decades, let's put it that way. If the goal, though, was to get around to the negotiating table, then it may still effectively achieve what you set out to do. So, I mean, this is a tenuous ceasefire. Both Iran and Israel are declaring victory. At this juncture, let's broker, perhaps with some of the Gulf states, a conversation, a negotiation. I know the Qataris are doing some negotiation as well. Again, is there a possibility for a long-term solution in the Middle East?
We've heard reports of Iran possibly moving some of that enriched uranium to safe spots, also some of its key equipment like the centrifuges. So in that case, if that's happened, wouldn't it logically be a case where the United States might need to pursue further military action?
Again, I think those are all questions that if there's going to be additional military action, I do think the president has to come to Congress, right? We have the War Powers Act. Is there unless there's an imminent threat to the United States, which right now it does not seem there's an imminent threat to the United States or our personnel, then we do think the president needs to come to Congress and we need to give him those authorizations.
I'm going to paint a rather extreme scenario for you here. President Trump has clearly said he's ruled out troops on the ground, American soldiers in Iran. But given a situation when Iran does not cooperate with the United States, do you worry about the fact that we would, or the United States would need to send troops on the ground because there's only that much that you can achieve by aerial bombings?
Right. Again, it's what are the goals of the bombings? If the goals are to get around to the negotiating table, then you can accomplish that, through where we are at this juncture. Iran is weakened, right? Israel has created really weaknesses within its air defense capabilities. You've seen the Israeli Air Force control the skies over Iran. My desire, I think many of my colleagues' desire, would be to speak directly to the Iranian people, to the regime, to say, come to the table. Let's see if there's a negotiated path forward. It's not going to be easy. The Iran nuclear deal in the Obama administration took a number of months, number of years to get there. But is there a context where you can lift some sanctions and in exchange Iran will put their nuclear program on hold?
You've alluded to this. Your colleagues the Democratic colleagues in the Senate and in the House, they've called action in Iran as unconstitutional and unauthorized. They say that only Congress has the power to declare war. What do you say?
I've reserved my judgment at this time. Again, if these missile strikes are to get around to the negotiating table and it's a one and done, that might be okay if it accomplishes that goal. On the other hand, if there's an escalation, if Iran takes actions against American assets, American troops in the region, and then President Trump wants to escalate this, he does have to come to Congress in my mind. At this juncture, the ceasefire does seem to be holding. It is tenuous. This is going to take a lot of diplomacy to move forward, but we've got to take that opportunity.
Coming to Congress and seeking approval, there are Republicans who will call that double standards because Democratic presidents in the past, be it Joe Biden in 2024 when it came to strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen, or 2011 as far as Barack Obama goes and those strikes on Libya, no congressional approval was sought. So wouldn't you agree that that in fact is a double standard?
Now again, I'm not the one calling for that authorization. It's what comes next. So, we would have supported Barack Obama when Assad used chemical weapons and crossed this red line. At that time, I think we would have supported President Obama taking some missile strikes to send a message saying that's not okay. Barack Obama chose to come to Congress for that authorization, which then kind of negotiated a different solution that got the Russians to take some of these chemical weapons out of Syria. Again, I think it's important at this moment in time for President Trump or his administration to come to Congress, brief us, again, is this a one-time thing, at which point this is over and the goal is to negotiate. That's what it seems like interpreting President Trump's words. But if he is going to escalate this, then I do think he does have to come to Congress. And I think Republicans would say the same thing.
Do you think he is going to come to Congress with a briefing on what happened with Iran?
Well, we had one scheduled yesterday with his top administration officials. We're told it's being rescheduled either for tomorrow or Friday. I hope that is the case.
And what are you hoping to hear?
I'm hoping to hear, if this was a one-time effort, to support the Israelis, but with the goal of getting around to the negotiating table, with the goal of degrading some of their nuclear capabilities, great. Give us your assessment, what happened. Again, the classified information is available for everyone to see. I think people will have questions. My colleagues will have questions. I would then, if this is going to be a negotiated solution, involve Congress in these negotiations, work with us on it. I think we have the same goal, which is a non-nuclear Iran, but the possibility of peace in the region.
None of your Democratic colleagues were informed about those strikes before they actually happened, that's correct?
That's my understanding. Again, historically, you would inform the Gang of Four or the Gang of Eight. That's the four top Democratic and Republican leaders. Usually that would include the four top intelligence members of Congress as well.
There's some suggestion that with DOGE and Trump's focus on his immigration crackdown, the intelligence apparatus has been redirected to those efforts, and therefore it makes the US more unsafe, especially now after the Iranian strike, meaning Iran could target the United States in terms of cyber attacks, potentially targeting water utilities, the power grid. Do you think there's some credence to that argument?
I have full confidence in our intelligence professionals, the folks that are career individuals. Obviously, there's political appointees that have come in with the Trump administration. I would hope that they're singularly focused on the national security threats. Immigration, in my mind, is not a national security threat. Now, certainly, the American public has spoken. They want to secure our borders. We should certainly vet people who are coming through. But right now, you've taken a military action against a known terror threat, in this case, Iran or its proxy groups. I think we should be directing all of our attention to potential counterattacks. And it may be asymmetric, like cyber attacks. They've done that in the past, obviously.
And the argument of, these agencies perhaps being distracted or preoccupied at this time rather than focusing on their core primary jobs.
Well, I would just say they should be refocused. And again, my hope is that they're refocused on the threat that's in front of us.
Let's talk about Taiwan in the context of Iran. You are the chair of the US Congressional Taiwan Caucus. You were recently in Taiwan. You took a delegation there, Democratic colleagues. You even met with the Taiwan president, President Lai. Just wondering, how concerned are you about China potentially taking Taiwan by force if the United States gets increasingly preoccupied with a widening Middle East conflict? And of course, there's that war in Ukraine as well.
Again, the goal to go to Taiwan, to bring some of my freshman colleagues to Taiwan, is to understand the complexity of the region. Our goal is to maintain the status quo of peace and stability in the region. I would hope that's China's goal as well. Obviously, Xi Jinping has stated a slightly different goal. This would be the wrong time for Xi Jinping or others in China to make a decision that might upset that status quo. I do think that, talking to Admiral Paparo, talking to our folks at US Indo-PACOM, everyone's ready to try to keep the peace and maintain stability and maintain the status quo in the region.
How committed do you think the Trump administration is to Taiwan?
That's a question for the Trump administration. I can speak on behalf of my colleagues in Congress, Democrats and Republicans. The Taiwan Caucus remains a very strong caucus. Both Democrats and Republicans continue to express their support for the people of Taiwan and the desire to maintain peace and stability across the strait.
There is a recent Reuters Source-based report that talked about the Trump administration increasing its arms sales to Taiwan more than what it did in its previous term, in the first term. So the last time we saw about $18 billion, so it could go much more than that. Is that perhaps heartening news to you that President Trump is committed to Taiwan?
That would suggest to me that the administration understands that it is important to have a deterrent ability, that Taiwan should have the ability to deter any unilateral actions by the PRC, by Beijing, and that would suggest to me that the Trump administration does have support for maintaining peace and stability in the region.
Let's turn to another flashpoint, that between India and Pakistan. President Trump has said that he stopped the war. Those are his words. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has categorically told President Trump that the ceasefire between India and Pakistan was between those two countries. And then you have Trump going ahead and meeting with Pakistan's army chief, many seeing that as a snub. Do you worry that the long-established relationship between the United States and India is now being strained?
Again, I'm not going to try to guess how President Trump is approaching this. I do applaud the Indians. Obviously, there was a heinous terror attack across the border. India did what it had to do in terms of retaliatory strikes. This could have escalated. The Indians and the Pakistanis chose to de-escalate the situation. It remains tense, obviously, talking to both ambassadors on both sides and delegations from both India and Pakistan. But again, we should be here in a supportive role as the United States, supporting both India and Pakistan. These are two very different countries. That should not be conflated. The relationship the United States has with India is one that's on a trajectory that continues to grow in the right direction. The Quad is extremely important to regional security, the economic relationship between the US and India. So it's not in India's interest to have a resumption of a war, but it does have to protect itself. It can't stand for cross-border terror attacks. Now let's look at Pakistan. Pakistan's a country that does have more domestic terror attacks than any other country in the world. It does have terrorist groups that are inside Pakistan.
And you've been quite vocal about it.
Yeah, so they've got to address that issue. And in exchange for that, it's an economy that's struggling. It has big debt problems and so forth. It's suffering from climate change. And so it's not in Pakistan's interest to resume a war either. So two very different countries on two different trajectories. Is there a way to find lasting peace and stability? It'll be small steps, right? This has been a decades-old conflict, but it's in the interest of both countries to try to find some longer-term solution. But it'll come down to the two countries.
Over the past decade, in your time in office, you've been quite vocal as to getting Pakistan to do something about terror within its own borders. Though some people might say that not just you, but the US as a whole is merely paying lip service to putting pressure on Pakistan. What can the United States really do in order to get a tangible change within Pakistan as far as terror goes?
I mean, it's in Pakistan's interest. This is a country that suffers from really heinous terror attacks domestically. You certainly see, folks coming across from the Afghanistan border and so forth. And then, they do have to address, if they want longer-term peace and stability, they do have to address cross-border terror attacks. So those are all things that we should put pressure on Pakistan to address. Now, it has other real economic issues. It has a major debt burden. It's going to have to renegotiate what that looks like. Obviously, water, climate change, all of those are longer-term issues. And they should be eyes wide open. China will address Pakistan in a very transactional way, only to the benefit of China. So where does that leave Pakistan? On the other side, India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, right? It's rapidly developing its economic relations, not just with the United States, but with the rest of the world. From a defense strategic perspective, we talked about the Quad, its maritime security strength, helping us in the Indian Ocean region to make sure there's freedom of navigation. So these are two countries, two neighbors that are going in different trajectories. I think India's trajectory is going to continue to climb. India's relationship with the West is going to continue to grow. What does Pakistan want to do for their future? What is their future? I think they have to decide that. And again, hopefully there is a better future. Hopefully, you can increase US-Pakistan economic relations and so forth. But, again, you have to have peace and stability inside Pakistan to accomplish that.
I get your point about Pakistan making a change for itself, but what is it that the United States can do to exert more pressure on Pakistan?
I mean, I'm not sure the pressure's necessarily going to work, other than continuing to support India as it starts to address its own security concerns and continues to move in the right direction. Can the United States have a role in negotiations? We're probably still the only country that has the diplomatic ability to do some of this. Now, that may look different under the Trump administration. Is there a role for countries like Japan that have economic relations with both India and Pakistan, or some of the Gulf states that may have different lines of communication? It's going to be complicated, right? If this was easy, it would have gotten resolved decades ago. But both countries have to want this. And again, it's not in India's interest to have a war, right? But India is rightfully concerned about protecting its own sovereignty and its own citizens and its own borders. And it's not in Pakistan's interest, given all the headwinds and challenges that Pakistan faces, for it to engage in a war. Again, for two very different reasons. So if it's in neither's interest, then there's got to be a path forward here.
India and the US are close to a trade deal, as you know. India toughening its stance, we're hearing, as far as those negotiations go. The United States, though, telling India that it has a first mover's advantage by going at it sooner rather than later. Do you agree?
Again, I'm not in the room. I would not approach trade and tariffs the way the Trump administration's approached it. We've, for a long time, tried to get a bilateral trade deal with India. It's always been an elusive item. Maybe we can get one done. So we'd be supportive of finding a resolution here. I think India, to its benefit, to meet some of the things that we want to accomplish, could be a major hub for redundant supply chains. Certainly it has a mature pharmaceutical industry, mature vaccine industry. There's lots of it, from a supply chain perspective, we could move things over. I'm a California guy, so Apple obviously is making some big investments there. Not thrilled with President Trump and some of his comments about Apple, but again, I think it's the right move to be moving some of that supply chain out of China and into India. And again, I think this is an opportunity for India.
Let's talk about the Democratic Party. Recent headlines that I've come across, all liberal press. The Atlantic saying Democratic Party slides into irrelevance. New York Times, the DNC is in chaos, desperate for cash. Washington Post, Democrats struggle to speak in one voice. What's happening here?
I think we just lost the presidential election after 4 years of very successful legislation. Biggest infrastructure bill ever passed, the biggest Chips and Science Act, major climate legislation, biggest expansion of veterans benefits. So really good policy, But what 2024 said is it wasn't about the policy that we passed. It was about people not feeling better. They're hurting in their pocketbooks. President Trump spoke to a lot of those issues, say, I'm going to bring prices down, et cetera. What we've seen in the first 6 months of the Trump administration is they've actually gone in the wrong direction. There's more economic insecurity, et cetera. And if you look at the elections that are taking place, Democrats are actually winning those elections by larger margins. The next big one will be the Virginia governor's race. Abigail Spanberger is going to win that election, but if she only wins by 3 percentage points, maybe it's not a big deal. But if she wins by 10 percentage points, that is going to demonstrate a wave that's moving in this direction. Now, that doesn't mean, as Democrats, we shouldn't just run against President Trump. We should say, here's how I'm going to help you. Here's how I would address the world and some of the complexity of the world. Here's how, to the American people, I'll make the cost of food, supplies, housing better and more accessible. I think that's really what matters to the American public.
And very lastly, do you agree with criticism that the Democratic Party is no longer a grassroots party, though, but in fact an elite party, a party for the elite?
You know, I think our policies are the right policies for working class Americans. You know, we want to expand healthcare. We want to make it more affordable. We want to protect the rights of working individuals. We've got to speak to those folks. We've got to be there. And yes, college-educated, wealthier folks have started to support the Democratic Party. That used to be the core of the Republican Party. So there's a shift taking place in politics right now. Again, the party that more quickly realizes that, and I think it will be the Democratic Party, is the party that wins the next election.
Congressman Bera, good luck.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for joining us here
You're
on
welcome,
NDTV.
of course.